You know, I thought it was such a great idea to have Tamara go first until you did such a great job and was so neat. What I'd like to do is offer, you know, perhaps some scattered provocations about this question that, and some of it perhaps in the more uncomfortable edge of discussing the Arab Spring, because my three colleagues up here we're going to be talking are so knowledgeable from a policy practitioner point about the nuts and bolts of the region. But I think there are far bigger issues that we just don't know how they're going to evolve and where things come out. If you were looking at global trends and change from around the world today from, say, Mars, you wouldn't be just looking at the Arab Spring. I just got back from a long trip to China, followed by a trip to the UAE. And the most consistent question I got during the last 14 days was how real was the Occupy Wall Street movement? Were we seeing a beginning of a protest exercise here that was somehow a sibling, if you will, of protest movements elsewhere in the world? And I don't have an answer to that. My gut feeling says that things are very different, that this isn't a moment of a global change in the equation between the ruler and ruled, even in the places like the United States and democracies. But I think it behooves us to be very careful as we think about what's going on in the Arab Spring as being something that's happening over there. There's been a lot of triumphalism in Washington, D.C., sort of an embedded pride, if you will, that somehow we've had something to do with what's happening, or that we can help nurture or cultivate the further positive development in the Arab Spring. And I think that these are possibly serious mistakes in assessment and could lead to some real mistakes in policy. I think that there's a very powerful explanation that's to say, while I think President Obama in the speeches that he's given on the Arab Spring and, you know, the various differences between Libya and Tunisia and Egypt and Syria and Yemen are absolutely right. And so when you look at these micro questions, I agree with the dissimilarity between issues, but there's some also macro factors in the world, and it may be very possible that the changed perception of American power in the infrastructure of America's place in the world and a sense of weakness and doubt in America's ability to achieve the things it does or says it's going to do may have a lot to do with the kind of macro ecosystem in which these changes are shifting. Because when you look at what's happening in the world, if I were to look at, you know, strategic classical allies, take Israel and Saudi Arabia, take Japan and Germany in various ways. The behavior of our strategic allies over a long period of time are changing in ways we wouldn't have seen 10 years ago. And if you were to look at the changing behavior of foes, I think that they're changing as well. If you look at the Middle East and look at the rivalries that are building and I think becoming hardened and more creatively deployed between Saudi Arabia and Iran throughout the Middle East, that, in a sense, is also a function, I think, of a perception of American disengagement or at least less capacity in the region. So I realize that this runs against some of the conventional wisdom that's often thought about U.S. power and engagement in the world, but what may be happening in the Middle East and the Arab Spring may be a function of the perception of American weakness, not a cause of the triumphalism or the success of a brand of democracy or the views of those have-nots in societies who want to see more. So that's one provocation that I wanted to offer. The other, I think, is very important. As a guy who's a blogger and spent a lot of time, I've been tweeting this a little bit last night and today, and social networks, and I really do feel and see when I move around the world the power of social networks and connectivity. In China, for instance, 900 million people have cell phones, 500 million are on the internet. And whether you like China's system and rule of law, there's a scale of things going out there beyond this country that's extraordinary, a global conversation. You know, I once, you know, I always fail with this. You know, at weddings sometimes I go and I've got a lousy line. I'll never get, you know, someone to make a toast again, but there's this great Jeremy Bentham line that I think is good, called "Happiness is a function of relative deprivation." It usually falls flat in an audience thing, but when you're in marriage and you think about it, to a certain degree, what you see is that that's a very important, I think, law of how societies think about opportunities, and as they come into contact with what they see other societies have. And I think this has been part of the global conversation, part of what social networking has done. It's changed the appetites of people. And we saw the peddler in Tunisia say, "I've had it with the rules and corruption," as Tamara just said, killed himself, and essentially sparked something where people around the world, armed with both more knowledge about what's going around the world, but saying we're not going to be as fearful, that the equation between ruler and ruled was changing. That had a lot to do both with what people are doing, but again, to talk about sort of DC's arrogance in all of this, that was a function of Silicon Valley. If you spend time on the west coast of the United States with biotech people, innovators, you see people who are phenomenally changing the world in ways that we don't. We approach from a policy and regulatory perspective, but we see things that are happening that DC is, characteristically trying to take credit for. The other trends I think that are interesting in the Arab Spring that I've been struggling with, and I don't know whether they're real or not real, is the fact that, and the U.S. being more reactive and behind events rather than in front of them. Over the last few years, Wada Kanfar, who's now the resigned former Director General of Al Jazeera, has been organizing an annual conference on political Islam and bringing together Muslim Brotherhood members, essentially, but other adherents of political. Dan, you were there once, I think. Maybe I'm wrong. Yeah, not that one. Another forum that Al Jazeera did. But it was an attempt to bring in different groups and have a discussion about democracy, political Islam, the rights of minority and majority views in different countries, but to sort of see and to hear from folks from Syria, Egypt, Tunisia, Lebanon, in a wide variety of areas, and have that conversation. And they would bring in a couple of Americans, I think largely as tokens, but I was always fascinated with this discussion, because you realize when you've stepped away from it that the US government has not had a strategy at all for engaging and dealing with political Islam. And what's interesting is you heard these people, political Islam and those adherents, those Muslim Brotherhood members, were the biggest proponents of what they believe democracy to be. And I think they have been part of the driving change through the Middle East. And it's going to be a very complicated equation for the United States that, again, I don't see us rushing to deal with that on the front end of that. And I think there are a lot of questions about democracy being used as a tool or the aspiration of democracy per se, or ballotocracy, being used as a tool to get into power and then to transition to something else. Also in the Arab Spring, and I'm sure that colleagues have mentioned this and Tamara implied it, I think that we've moved from highly static, rigid regimes, in which Tamara was right, that it's absolutely the time had come, moving to very fluid circumstances. And we may see lots of convulsions. It reminds me of that Arnold Schwarzenegger Terminator movie where he's dying in the pit, and he comes out, there's a, face, the face that keeps coming up over and over. We may see many, many different variants of governments coming in, going out quickly, and this notion of a binary choice between totalitarian arrangements and democracy is a fairly vapid and unrealistic one. That I think is not going to be there. The other thing I wanted to put on the table, that had been part of the U.S. discussion on the Arab Spring, my friend, very, very good friend, that I respect a great deal but frequently disagree with, Anne-Marie Slaughter, wrote a piece for The Atlantic it was originally titled The New Age of Intervention. I've subsequently noticed this morning that she changed the title, but there are feeds that have it listed as The New Age of Intervention. And in this, it was essentially part of a moment where she was questioning whether what we did in Libya was intervention or not. And from her perspective, from a legal arrangement, what Responsibility to Protect, R2P, did is it has changed the equation of outside powers versus other powers when those powers essentially forfeit, in line with the notion of responsibility to protect, their sovereignty because of a violated deal with their citizens. And thus, those citizens necessarily, and the responsibility of the international community to work with them to protect them in their interests, is essentially an organic and an inside thing rather than outside thing of an intervention. Now you have to, you may think that that's a bit of a pretzel to think through, and I do think it is there, but there are many that are trying to take the Libya exercise and turn it into a cookie cutter in terms of applying it to other cases around the world. I think it's going to be very, very hard. I think there is no new age of intervention. I spent some time in the White House trying to get my head around what were the terms of engagement in the Libya exercise. And this can be debated at length. If you read the Time magazine profile of Hillary Clinton and what she did, it's going to run quite differently from the Michael Hastings story that just ran in Rolling Stone that showed more of Obama's hand in it. There are a lot of people that have different takes on this. But the 5 items that Barack Obama put on the table for intervention in Libya, if we were going to proceed on the eve of the decision, and with different tracks, both the Pentagon and State Department, Susan Rice and others working, is that they were expecting, number 1, a material, not just rhetorical support from Arab leaders. 2, that they wanted no unilateral action, that they wanted to act multilaterally but concurrent with our interests. 3, no boots on the ground. 4, consistent with legal mandates, meaning what the UN could produce and do. 5, it had to be effective, meaning not a no-fly zone for no-fly zone's sake, that would not solve the problem. So that little clause in the UN was always the place where the real debate was about other means or what other necessary means. And then finally, a well-defined, achievable goal, very much focused around Benghazi. And what Obama, to a certain degree, in my view, hatched, possibly, but the White House has been terrible at marketing it, is a new kind of intervention in the sense that this was not a one-size-fits-all, and it was also not something that some of us might, like myself, were worried about, that would create a slippery slope to a deep engagement in Libya where we would own the outcome and the process from beginning to end. This was the president creating very, very clear and limited criteria, very constrained criteria on engagement. And this was what was needed. And I think if you look at Syria and others, I think that this explains why we aren't going to do more if they maintain this template. But when you look at these others, it was to offer a chance to rebels, that many revolutions don't work out on behalf of those rebelling. That's one of the rules of history, is that you see many cases where things don't work out. And what President Obama and I think NATO somewhat did is to give them a tipping point opportunity to try and take advantage of it, but there was no guarantee of fundamental success in the end. And what the president did, in my view, is he essentially took a page out of what we did with the G20 during the global financial crisis. That in that case, you move beyond the traditional incumbents around the world that dealt with global economic issues, and you broadened the players significantly. And to some degree, Libya is a messier example, but it's very much example that while we talk about France, Britain, and the United States allying together to do something, far more important that Qatar, Jordan, and the United Arab Emirates took very direct action, were right there on the front line with money, material, planes, and people, also working covertly, and that there were other Arab League members that did as well, that the G20ification of national security issues, what some people have wrongly called leading from behind, is, in a sense, a very smart strategy if the stock of power that the United States has in the world to deal with these things isn't as high as it used to be. You can call it the Tom Sawyer strategy, how to try and get others to paint your fence. And to some degree, that may be the smartest kind of power and change in the world, of trying to figure out how to do that. But one needs to be humble and careful, because I agree with Tamara in what was one of her final points, was that what seems to be moving in the Arab Spring, where we've been largely behind, we've been on the edges, but we don't have, we're not going to advocate these kinds of changes in Saudi Arabia. We clearly haven't in Bahrain. Yemen is still a mess. Syria is a very different kind of engagement. I was worried the moment that President Obama made his decision, that the moment you saw an alliance of Britain, the United States, and France taking an intervention in Libya, that the narrative would change from the brave people on the street challenging their government to the question of what would or what would not the U.S. and its allies do. And you would take the cameras off the street. And I think the president deserves a lot of credit for not letting this be a slippery slope into a deeper engagement, and to doing everything he could to maintain the cameras on those rebels and whatnot in Libya. So it's a very different kind of model that I hope we can learn from, but the biggest thing is that this is going to go on for years and years and years, that there are big questions out there I think about the limits of American power actually being one of the drivers of the Arab Spring as much as the capabilities we may bring to bear. So thank you.
Thank you.